Afrocentricity is the idea that we're viewing the phenomenon from an African-centered perspective, studying the world from that perspective. I think the most important aspect of it is that the people can see it and people can be influenced by the ideas that are on the program. That it takes ideas beyond the campus and it makes people aware of ideas that they never have thought of before. Welcome to our program, Afrocentricity. I am your host, Michael Washington. Today's program is part of our symposium on human rights. Today's topic is linguistic racism and the language of politics. Here, we wish to explore how language is used as weapons of oppression and empowerment. To introduce our panel and moderate our discussion, we're privileged to have the world-renowned community organizer and human rights activist, Daniel Allen Buford. Now, Daniel's research and ideas on this topic were critical to the formation of the foundational curriculum of the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. I have in my hands a initial brochure as created by Dr. James Norman Dunn, who was the architect of this training model. And you can see in this brochure that this is way back in the early 1980s. Some of our trainers, you'll see there's Daniel Buford. And under his name it says, Reverend Daniel Buford discusses linguistic racism. So this goes all the way back to the early part of the 1980s, late 1970s, and you'll see there's renowned people on this. You'll see Reverend C.T. Vivian, you'll see Ann Braden, you'll see Barbara Major, you'll see Sheila Collins, and some of these, and there's many others, including the Reverend David Billings, who's one of our panelists. So this goes way back. He's an expert on this topic, and we hope to have a fine panel. But in addition, he has taken cases before the United Nations in New York and Switzerland. He brings a wealth of information about this topic. And without further delay, here's Daniel Buford, our moderator.
Thank you, Dr. Washington. I want to thank everyone who is watching this and the various participants who will be here in a moment as both the panelists and the respondents. And I will introduce them after I flesh out the topic a little bit more here. We're here today to talk about linguistic racism, which is racism as it manifests itself in language. And linguistic racism occurs as a result of a historical interaction between conquerors and the people that they have conquered. That is to say that once people have been conquered, whether they be in Africa, the Americas, or anyone else, anywhere else, the people who do the conquering then force those who are now conquered to redefine themselves according to the language of that dominating culture. And so that anybody who refers to those people who were dominated have to refer to them and define them according to the language of those who are the dominant culture. Not only that, but these are words and phrases that on the one side of the equation, while they degrade the people who have been conquered, these are words and phrases that uplift and almost deify the people from the conquering culture, so that they have a false sense of superiority, internalized racial superiority, not even from their own attitude, but based on the way that the language structure is set up. And and everyone has to look up to them according to the ways that the language is set up, and as they look down on the people who have been conquered. So then, let me just read here very quickly more of a fleshed out definition of linguistic racism. Linguistic racism is a form of racism that manifests in language. It occurs as a result of the historical interaction when a dominant and conquering culture forces its values and language on oppressed people and all speakers of the language. Linguistic racism reinforces the social order valued by the conquering culture and reinforces internalized oppression within individuals and groups. Over time, the original language of the invaded culture is completely replaced by the language of the conqueror, which in turn fosters historical amnesia and cognitive dissonance through the loss of the mother tongue. Now here's some features of linguistic racism. Linguistic racism can be observed in any dictionary, thesaurus, or website of the English language when looking for words and phrases that reduced humanity and turned conquered people and their descendants into objects while affirming the culture of the conquerors. Some words from history that are emblematic of this are slave, contraband, colored, buck, chattel, darky, uncivilized, savage, underdeveloped, master, master race, white, European, Western culture, majority, white supremacy, and white citizens council, just to name a few concepts there. Also, words and phrases that have negative, denotative, and connotative dictionary definitions and apply to racial and cultural groups. Once again, some examples are the words black, nigger, pickaninny, which comes from the Spanish pequeño niño, savage, renegade, hostile, minority, mumbo jumbo, sambo, coon, yellow peril, mongoloid, idiot, chink, wetback, illegal alien, black codes, terrorists, eugenics, welfare mother, wop, Slav, gypsy, and vandals. Words and phrases that count and measure and quantify the humanity of oppressed people and their offspring. Examples here are the words mulatto, quadroon, octoroon, minority, full blood, half-breed, mixed blood, multiracial, 3/5 clause of the U.S. Constitution, blood quantum laws that are used very oppressively in Indian culture, Creole and Mestizo and Jabo. Words and phrases that have negative meanings and usages derived from the root of the word as derived from the Indo-European languages. Some examples: Negro, Negroid, mulatto, aborigine, Hottentot, bastard, or bastard as it would be in South Africa, Kafir, Untermenschen, which is German for subhuman, Schwarzer, and black. Words and phrases that disrespect and desecrate that which is sacred to conquered people and their descendants. We can look at the names of military helicopters and the names of athletic teams that use Native American cultural names and symbols for mascots. So then our panelists are here to talk about how linguistic racism appears in modern political discourse and political language and is weaponized in the language of the people who are now saying that they represent the dominant white supremacy culture. And so that words and phrases that we would think are harmless now have the function of a weapon. The great linguist and thinker Harold Laswell, formerly of MIT University, he was tasked with deciphering Nazi and communist propaganda during the 1930s and 40s, and he came up with a methodology that I used when in looking at linguistic racism and then isolating these words as propaganda themes. So what we're going to do today is we're going to ask our panelists to look at the ways that the weaponized language that has racial overtones and negative overtones are now appearing in political language and are being weaponized. Harold Laswell said that the thing that most resembles a weapon in terms of language is a missile, because both the word and the missile can inflict damage from a long distance. So then over the distance of centuries, oceans, and miles, cultures, these words, when they use, are spoken and then explode in the minds of the people to dehumanize them, and then to make them see themselves and everybody else inferior, who's defined that way. So today we're very happy to have Dr. Michael Washington, who is our very gracious host here at Northern Kentucky University. He's been here long enough now to be the president, so I don't know what's up with that, but we'll talk about that later. But Dr. Mike is the founder of everything that this place is doing with respect to black culture and black history, so we're very happy to have Brother Mike here. We have Sister Esther Yazzie. Esther Yazzie is a person that we admire and respect. She used to do translation for me and interpretation for me when I was setting up prayer vigils on the Navajo reservation in response to not only what they were doing in outlawing the Dr. King holiday in Arizona, but also in response to what they were doing in terms of displacing Navajo elders from their land. So we're very happy to have Queen Esther Yazzie with us. And then we have the Reverend Dr. David Billings here as a respondent, who is one of the stalwart people of this series, who's graciously enough consented to be here. He is the author of the book Deep Denial, which explores white people and their viewpoints on privilege and their denial of that in the society. And we have two respondents on the line who will go after our main panelist, that is Reginald Lyles, retired police captain in the Bay Area. And we have Sister Reverend Joanne McClendon, who I met first in Oakland when we were both at the Allen Temple Baptist Church serving under J. Alfred Smith, Jr. and Sr. And she now is here in Kentucky leading a ministry down in Louisville. So we're very happy to have all of those people here to share their wisdom. Dr. Michael Washington, could you hold forth first on the topic of linguistic racism and weaponized language in political discourse?
Absolutely. Let me say that during the time that I'm speaking, one of my students might come in, and she will serve as a student respondent if she's able to get it. She's in class now, but she's very anxious about being a part of this. And what I'm talking about here now is called linguistic racism and the weaponization of political language. Let me begin by saying that the conservative opponents of critical race theory seek to impose white privilege laws and white supremacy laws onto the agendas of our state legislatures in order to racialize the state's educational curriculum to fit the image and interest of the superior race. Because of this, it is urgent that people of color develop an understanding of what we refer to in this discussion as the weaponization of language. But how can we tell when language has been weaponized against us? More importantly, how can we deploy language in behalf of our interest? In this case, to prevent this state from using education as a vehicle to violate our human rights. These are difficult questions to answer. However, the more we know about linguistic racism, the better equipped we are to recognize when language has been weaponized against our interest. We will also be better prepared to use language as a weapon to defend our right to be human. By linguistic racism, we mean the use of language to define, maintain, and perpetuate a race-structured society in the interest of the superior race. By language, we mean the cultural utterances or written symbols that define reality. Every culture has utterances for greetings such as hello or goodbye. All cultures use language to make laws as well as to define every other aspect of their realities. When these utterances and symbols are products of cultures that have been structured to legitimize white dominance or hegemony, language necessarily functions to sustain and justify the superior race's right to rule. The development of the American culture is a good example of this. The United States government, as we know it today, came into existence in 1790 upon the ratification of the Constitution. By then, both the political culture and the popular culture of the citizens had conformed to, as normal behavior, the subjugation of the Native Americans and the subordination of the American Negro. Evidence of this may be found in the language used in the United States Constitution. The political document that defines the qualifications for representation in the government. The language used in Article 1, Section 2 functions to legitimize the right of the superior race to disqualify non-white populations from being represented as citizens. According to the Constitution, the groups excluded are, quote, Indians not taxed and 3/5 of all other persons, end of quote. In this case, the linguistic weapons were the deployment of the words Indians and 3/5 of all other persons. The words were weapons because it was the superior race's effective use of racial nomenclature that targeted people of color for structural dehumanization, unworthy of citizenship in the United States. According to white cultural folklore, the only good Indian is a dead Indian. In the same way that the Native Americans were labeled unworthy of citizenship because they were rendered too insignificant to be taxed, the enslaved African Americans were, by virtue of the science of mathematics, unworthy of citizenship because they were less than human. Only 3/5 of a person, to be exact. This means that the very structure of the United States government and its cultural foundation are based on the legal dehumanization of the original occupants of the land. It was also structured to abuse people from Africa by forcing them into unpaid labor in order to stabilize the new government's economy. Just as the Constitution clearly identified the groups that would be excluded from citizenship, the Naturalization Act of 1790 created the American melting pot when it made explicit those who would qualify. The language used was, quote, any alien being a free white person, end of quote. This made it possible for people throughout Europe to immigrate to the new nation and surrender their national and ethnic identities in exchange for the privilege of blending into the superior race. When they left their local communities, they viewed themselves as English, Scottish, Irish, etc. They may have identified ethnically as Celtic, Gaelic, Saxon, and so on. What they discovered upon their U.S. arrival was that effectiveness at melting into white America meant leaving their cultural-based identities at home. When Europeans immigrated into the American South, they assumed roles such as overseer of slaves, or they administered the maiming, branding, and beating of the non-white Africans. The melting pot was at its best when the European immigrants were seamless in blending in with the local poor whites who not only supervised the pillories, whipping posts, holding pens and gallows, but who were also employed in the auction block industry where Negroes were the commodities being auctioned. Although the vast majority of the European immigrants remained poor, the culture of race imposed upon them a superior caste over the Negroes, slave or free. But not all European immigrants consented to shedding their national and ethnic cultures in exchange for a racial identity. Large numbers returned to Europe. Many took an active position against the dehumanization of Africans, and in 1791, during George Washington's administration, they introduced a word into the English lexicon: abolitionist. This new anti-racist identity was not restricted to the United States, but was an international movement to abolish the privilege of white people to dehumanize Africans in what they euphemistically called the slave trade, although not a single African willingly traded him or herself into slavery. Some Northerners took issue with slave masters from the South controlling the national government in the interest of the South. They believed that slave master presidents in Thomas Jefferson's political party did not represent the interest of the North's Federalist Party, who incidentally supported Toussaint Louverture's Haitian Revolution. Some whites loved the new American culture and language, but held disdain for the degrading treatment and dehumanizing nomenclature for black people, such as 3/5 of a person, Negro slave, mulatto, quadroon, octoroon, etc. They understood that the use of these words in American culture compelled white Americans to devalue the humanity of African people. Some whites, like Noah Webster, became abolitionists. In 1791, Webster co-founded the Abolitionist Society of Connecticut. Being a true patriot in the tradition of the Federalist Party, Webster was recruited by the High Federalist himself, Alexander Hamilton, to edit the Federalist Party newspaper. He was not just an editor, but a committed educator and is often referred to as the father of American scholarship and education. Also, because of his contributions as a lexicographer to the development of American English with his spelling books and dictionaries, other scholars call him the father of cultural independence. Not only did he change the spelling of some English words to an American English rendition, but he added new words like chowder, hickory, squash, even skunk to the American vernacular, words that whites had learned from Native Americans. The first publication of Webster's An American Dictionary of the English Language appeared in 1828. By the end of the next decade, the racialization of the United States had introduced new nomenclature in reference to blacks into American culture by way of popular entertainment. The words blackface minstrelsy emerged as the first form of national entertainment in the United States by depicting black people as an object of laughter. This insidious device of oppression expanded the American lexicon with words like jump Jim Crow, zip coon, and Sambo, words that lampooned an entire race as dim-witted, lazy, buffoonish, superstitious, and happy-go-lucky. This racist form of entertainment was a response to the effectiveness of the Black Lives Matter movement of its time. This movement of blacks and anti-racist, anti-slavery whites took the form of militant abolitionism, like the justice-seeking whites involved in the George Floyd protests in our times. The militant abolitionists sought immediate justice for the daily oppression heaped upon the African American community. The pursuit of justice by these interracial social change agents were challenged by a linguistic arsenal even more dangerous and damaging than the ones deployed in national entertainment: the language of science. According to Southern physician Samuel A. Cartwright, the buffoons and rascals portrayed by the whites in the minstrel shows were not just characters of ridicule, but the classical symptoms of drapetomania and dysesthesia ethiopica, diseases suffered only by the American Negro. The intensification of the abolitionist movement, the Underground Railroad, and the tendency among blacks to refuse to work or slow down the work pace by breaking tools and destroying property were, from Cartwright's perspective, expression of the Negro's pathological state of mind. To counter the gains of the black-white anti-slavery activity, especially the abolitionists and Underground Railroad participants, Cartwright deployed the weapon of language to justify the denial of black citizenship. To create the disease of drapetomania, Cartwright reached back to the ancient Greek language and discovered the word drapetes, which means a runaway or person in flight or fleeing. Because the derivative mania means madness or frenzy, Cartwright combined the two in order to invent a word that described blacks' quest for freedom as pathological or insane. When free blacks were reluctant to work like slaves for whites, they were diagnosed as suffering from dysesthesia ethiopica, or hebetude of mind. Overseers of slaves referred to the condition as rascality. The lesson here? In a society structured on white supremacy, the language alone prohibits black freedom. From the standpoint of white supremacists, it is inconceivable, even ludicrous, to grant citizenship to a pathological buffoon. Even after the Civil War, when the enslaved blacks were made free, the language of the white supremacist social order held them in captivity. What African Americans called the freedom to assemble was translated in Webster's American English vernacular as the crime of vagrancy, and the penitentiary replaced the plantation as the basic institution of black oppression. From the standpoint of the white supremacists, sticks and stones may break their bones, but words will define them as psychologically unfit for citizenship. Today's activists will do well to understand how the effective deployment of language disempowers as well as empowers communities. They must view language as a weapon of redemption, a double-edged sword, a disempowering edge, and an edge to define, defend, and develop their interest. It is not enough to use words to protest. Words must also be utilized politically as weapons to proactively defend the integrity of vulnerable communities and constituency groups. For instance, even as we engage in this discussion, the Republicans have thrust forth critical race theory as a subterfuge and a decoy. Because this theory is not taught in any of the school districts that are advocating against it, the words critical race theory are code words to influence the legislatures to diminish the value of black studies and ethnic studies education in the public schools. If the bills pass, teachers will not be responsible for including the experiences of oppressed minority groups in their lessons. They seek the political leverage to legitimately use words as concealed weapons to create lesson plans that obliterate from memory the struggles of people of color to change the system that was structured to oppress them. The historical fear of large numbers of white people organizing around the belief that black lives really matter have compelled today's white supremacists to focus the nation's attention on the contrived critical race theory controversy, while the Republicans strategically weaponize and deploy words with deadly precision at vulnerable, targeted communities. Precise terms and phrases like failure to pre-register 17-year-olds, student voting restrictions, and unwillingness to place polling sites on college campuses are strategies aimed directly at students. When veterans, ex-felons, and differently abled people are the targets, the weaponized language may sound like barriers for homeless voters to voter registration, failure to accommodate voters with disabilities, failure to inform formerly incarcerated persons of their voting rights or eligibility to vote. Immigrants from Muslim and Spanish-speaking worlds are faced with language requiring proof of citizenship and a myriad of methods of language discrimination, like a lack of language-accessible materials. The words that target Native American voters are captured by phrases like failure to accept Native American tribal IDs, barring Native American voters through residential address requirements for Native American lands which have P.O. boxes, and failure to place polling sites on Native American land, etc. Republicans believe that African American voters exposed the fragility of white supremacy when they demonstrated to the world how the determination and the power of long lines of black voters can remove a white supremacist from the White House. Because of this, they target the black communities with a myriad of disfranchisement methods, including, but not limited to, racial gerrymandering, creating complicated absentee ballot requirements, creating polling places confusing by splitting black precincts, creating complicated absentee ballot requirements, creating absentee ballot short return deadlines, exacting match requirements for signatures or other information, and by intimidating black voters. For African American voters, all of the other constituent groups, these methods should not be viewed only as weaponized language of disempowerment, but rather an arsenal to define the strategies to be executed in defense of the dignity and humanity of vulnerable communities. For instance, students must hold educational forums, teach-ins, and workshops on voter education. They must be aware of the various types of student voting restrictions and organize themselves to ensure that the qualifications for student voters are clear and fair, and that there are ample polling sites on their campuses and communities, etc. Whether in rural areas, suburbs, reservations, barrios, or inner-city ghettos, the task of effective community organizers are to subvert the words of disenfranchisement into strategies for community empowerment. They must live by the adage, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words provide the arsenal for my empowerment.
Thank you, Dr. Washington. I'll just say quickly before Queen Esther comes on that in your talking, you were talking about how words are used surreptitiously, mischievously, to hide their real intent. And I was talking about the work of the linguist Harold Laswell, who wrote the book Studies in Quantitative Semantics, Studies in the Politics of Language. He didn't have it back then, but today we have what are called cloaking devices. That is to say, a weapon not only has its power to destroy, but it has its power to hide its intentions to destroy. That is, being able to fly under the radar, or stealth technology, and so on. So we see that same thing happening with words, particularly the various words and phrases that have been identified with Dr. Washington just now. Our next presenter is Esther Yazzie. She does interpretation and translation, dare I say, for the federal court system in the Southwest region, New Mexico, Arizona, sometimes in Utah. So we're very honored and privileged to have her here, and hopefully Dr. Kenneth Tankersley on October the 12th, which used to be Columbus Day, but out in Berkeley is Indigenous Peoples Day, and apparently the people here have taken away the Columbus Day appellation, but the state capital is still named after him, so we still got some work to do. So Esther, could you give us your response to the idea of weaponized language and political language and how that works in Indian country?
I want to start off by saying Yate, which means hello. And thank you for inviting me. And I'm Esther Yazzie Lewis. I am Dene. We say Dene for Navajo. And so I'm Tohiet Nishnedo, but Anibashachin. And we always introduce ourselves by who our mother is, our father, our paternal grandfather, and our maternal grandfather, because we're a matrilineal clan system. And I didn't get to finish off what Michael said at the beginning, and also hearing Daniel talk about linguistic racism and defining it. But I'm going to say that Navajo was my first language. I spoke Dene before I spoke English, and I learned English at age 6 at the United Methodist Boarding School in Farmington, New Mexico. So I want to say that I'm a product of linguistic racism, because I look at myself like that after looking at the language racism and looking at myself and saying that my first language was Navajo and I learned English at 6. And so I look back at what Dr. Washington was saying about the language invasion, and looking at myself, I say I'm a product of it, because my language was the Navajo language. My mother tongue was taken away from me, and I'm a product of that language invasion, and have grown to learn English, speak it, and also live the Western culture in the way that we live today, and how we use the Western culture to live our life here. And I believe that I'm a good example, because my language was first Navajo and taken away. At the time that it was taken away at age 6, I was a student who was forbidden to speak Navajo, Dene. And there were times when I had soap put in my mouth so that I wouldn't speak Navajo. The soap was used to wash away the language which they thought was not a good language. It was a dirty language. So the soap symbolizes the cleansing of your mouth to speak English, the imperial language. Since I was at the United Methodist Boarding School, I was not only forbidden to speak my Navajo language, but I was also forbidden not to learn the ways of my Navajo life, and not even to practice it. And so you see that the Methodist school taught Navajos to be Christians and not be Navajos. And we were told our ways were heathen, and we were evil if we did those things. And to worship Christ And the church, going to church was a way that we would be saved. And so, learning all that, all my brothers and sisters are Christian, and I'm the only one that has gone on to learn my Navajo heritage and language. And I do speak the Navajo language. And so I listened to Daniel Buford's definition on racism and how it manifests the language, and how people that speak the English language are, their ways are taken away, and how you become a product of that superior race. And I don't look at them as a superior race, because I believe my race, the Navajo people, the Dene people, are also a superior race. And so I don't give credit to the ways of the colonizers, because I feel the colonizers did what they did to subjugate Native Americans and take the land and rape the land and prosecute the Navajo and the Native Americans in taking away their way of life. And that's a genocidal process where Native Americans are to be melted into the melting pot, as Michael said. Washington, Dr. Washington. I look at a book called Language and Thought and Action. And in that book, back in 1943, I see that in 43, 45, that Mrs. Roosevelt and Winston Churchill were trying to develop an imperial language, an international language, and that was the English language. And that English, and they were defining it by saying the English language is spoken all over the world. And the conquerors of this country also spoke English, and they invaded this land with their language. And I uphold the fact that Dr. Washington brought that out, which tells me, in my Navajo upbringing and my Navajo traditional people that have told me that language has power. Our language has power and it has strength. And I look at it to say that all language has power. And that was brought up with Dr. Washington saying, how language and also how Daniel brings up language as a way of taking and invading your way of life, where we say a good Indian is a dead Indian. And a good Indian is if you live the Western society and culture and language, then your traditional ways of Native American culture is dead. And that's what that all means, because Colonel Washington wrote things like that in his writings of how he subdued the Navajo people and Native Americans, saying that a good Indian is a dead Indian. And so you see in society that I say I'm a product of it, because I had to learn to live two worlds. I had to learn the Navajo way of life and then to bridge into the Western way of life. Because in order for me to be a Navajo person functioning and being influential to my Navajo people, I had to still learn the Navajo ways of life, the Navajo medicine men, the Navajo traditional fundamental ways of understanding what the four directions mean and what the colors of the four directions mean, why Mother Earth is Mother Earth, and why Father Sky and the sun being the father and the moon being the mother. Learning those ways, and also at the same time understanding the Western ways of learning things and understanding that that's the superior race's language, and they had subjugated us through their language as a weapon. And I look at it as they use the Navajo language in um, the Navajo code talkers. If we wanted to look at the military weaponized code, the Navajo people back in 1940s during World War II, you see that the Navajo language is used as a military code. And the military code, being the Navajo language, what they were unable to decode the language, which goes back to the fact that Navajo people say their language is spiritual and it's powerful. And so the Navajos believed that their language was used to kill off many people. And in the process of it, it was the government that did this. Now we go back to the mining of uranium back in the same years, and that the mining of uranium that was done by the Navajo people were also used to make atomic bombs that also hit Nagasaki and Hiroshima and killed thousands of people again. And so Navajo people look at themselves as their language and the uranium that was mined helped the government, this country, to kill off a lot of people. And they see what they did and they feel like they're victimized by that, in the sense that they jinxed themselves by helping the government of this country to kill off so many people in their war in World War II. And they're not, and they feel victimized in the sense that now their language has been used and their land is contaminated and their water and air is contaminated by the uranium mining that has taken place on their land. And so how do we correct this? Because nobody wants to come and clean up all of this. And who cleans it up for us? It's almost like they look at themselves as they did it to themselves and they should have never done it, because this language was given to them by the Creator. And mining the uranium was also another process of the consequences that lays upon them today, even with the COVID. And so I see that, talking to Navajo people in that sense, I had to learn not only my Navajo ways of looking at things, and also looking at ways of how I become a part of the Navajo Society. And so I work for the United States District Courts. And when I first started working for the United States District Courts, myself and two other individuals, a Navajo linguist and a Navajo Supreme Court judge, helped me to put together a glossary of legal terms which certified the Navajo language. And the language and the glossary of that language was taken before the Judicial Congress in Washington, D.C. And we certified the Navajo language to say that Navajo language is still a language of our country, our land, as Navajo people. And to use that language to help Navajo people to understand when they are charged with a crime on the reservation that are white collar crimes. And so learning all of that and living that, I believe that it was very necessary for me to be a product of understanding how language can be used against us and how language can conquer us. But at the same time, through my own learning and understanding, I'm trying to tell Navajo people that we have to use our language. And everybody in this world, they all have a language. There's Chinese, there's Germans, there's Spanish. These countries that speak these language, their strength comes from the language. If you speak your language, that's a God-given language. And that's where the power of resisting and being able to sustain yourself as that race to continue into the future That's where the power lies within our language. And I'm trying to tell the Navajo people that their Dene language has great force of defeating and making things right and healing and giving people some fortitude and stamina to say that we can take care of ourselves and we don't need to rely on the United States government. We don't need to rely on the state government. We don't need to rely on our tribal government. I said tribal government because our government was put together by the United States government in 1923. In 1923 was when they wanted to come in with the big corporations to mine the raw resources. And the United States then needed leaders to sign the contract and agreements with the corporation. And so it was not built to help Navajo people, but it was put together to mine raw resources on the reservation. And remember, the reservation is also a word that says we don't own the land. We just occupy the surface of the land. What's in the ground, the raw resources, doesn't belong to us. The land itself belongs to the United States government.
Esther.
That's why.
Yeah, go finish your point and then
Okay. All major crimes are taken to the federal court. And I know that working in the federal courts also, when Navajo people and indigenous people say, in agreement, they think that that's an admission to a crime. And so they find themselves charged with more crimes. So the evaluation of whether you're competent to be representing yourself in court is also another evaluation that's made by the white society. And I know that I witnessed a Navajo man being told in the evaluation questioning to determine if he was competent was, do you know which way the Amazon River is? And he said, to the east. The man didn't know anything about the Amazon River. And because he gave the wrong answer, you would automatically understand that he's going to be charged as an incompetent person because he was never told or never instructed which way the Amazon River is. So white society make these examinations and evaluations to fit their society and how they see it. They don't do it to accommodate the Native Americans and what they go through. So I would end with this. Language is a powerful weapon when used in the wrong way.
Amen. Thank you. And thank you for that personal statement and testimony about your growing up and your mother tongue being Dene, Navajo, and then being forced to wash your mouth out with soap if you spoke that language in order to speak the more pure language of English. A lot of people don't know that kind of anecdotal history that comes from the history of the boarding schools and how those were used as instruments of oppression and acculturation to kill the Indian and save the man by turning the Indian man into an apple that is red on the outside and white on the inside. Brother David, you've heard a few comments. What are your comments? We know that they're going to be deep and pithy.
Well, I always learn so much from people like Queen Esther Yazzie Lewis. And remember, the first time I ever heard the term linguistic racism was from you, Reverend Buford, and then Michael Washington, showing how the dominant culture history using English only as a tactic to justify and institutionalize racism. Dr. Jim Dunn, a major influence on so many of us on this screen, and so many thousands otherwise. I remember he would start his workshops off with writing on the board. He wouldn't say anything, and he would write INVALID. And then he would ask the group to say out loud what those letters stood for. And basically half of the group would say invalid, and the other half of the group would say invalid. And he would say, well, what is it? And lead into a whole discussion of the power of race, power of words and phrases. And it's always stuck with me. He would ask, if there was a bus in New York City that would come around, and he would have INVALID coach on the side of the bus. And he said, the people who are boarding that bus every day, what do they take in? Are they invalid? Are they invalid? Are they both? It was a powerful teaching tool in terms of the internalized messages. I learned that again a couple of years ago when Marjorie Freeman and I, whose name is on my screen, we moved once again to the Bronx, and there was a march about Black Lives Matter. It was a very mixed march, racially and everything. And I was wondering, I said, now, if they knocked on my door and I came down the stairs, who would they see? Because I no longer have the mobility that I once did physically. And I wondered, would they see someone who had tried to work, since his teenage years against racism, or would they see someone who physically embodied possibly everything they were marching against? This idea of white man, white woman, white people. Anytime you put white in the English language in front of everything, anything, it denotes a status, it denotes a superiority, so that white people are reinforced with this sense of being special, of being universal in our humanity. And it's very interesting, Dr. Mike or Reverend Buford, you started off, talking about, who is considered human, and in the creation of the United States, not for many, a couple of hundred years, only white people were fully human. Everybody else was seen as some gradation of humanity. The concept of minority in this country has not to do with numbers so much as it has to do with defining one's status in relationship to the dominant culture. You have minority rights, meaning you have less rights. These are not natural rights. They are not human rights, but they must be rights granted to you by those whose power has been legitimized and sanctioned in the United States. The term missiles, that words are like missiles, as Queen Esther said, and it strikes me that in the professions now, the helping professions of social work, of advocacy, of any number of other words that connote kind of working for to better society, that you no longer have to even not only have a relationship with persons who are deemed of minor interest in the institutional systemic arrangement of this country. You don't have to enter their communities. There's no way to be held accountable by the people you serve. In the internet, you can just zoom in and you can zoom out. You know, you can become a professional advocate for people's various rights with no relationship to the people themselves. And when there's no relationship to people, there's no way to hold you accountable by the people. So our professions have found ways to distance ourselves from the reality. And this is in many ways, a linguistic process of domination. The idea of full humanity, 100% humanity, is what will compromise those poor peoples who were immigrating from the European nations and becoming white, you know, instead of allying themselves with people being enslaved, with the indigenous peoples whose land they were used to occupy. You know, you became white because white was synonymous with humanity and with legal sanction. So a phrase that I grew up with in Mississippi was, well, I might be poor, but at least I'm white. I'm free, white, and 21. I'd hear it all the time, never explained, but I was internalizing it. So that, you know, in this country, it's very difficult because English is used as again was said, as the language of the conqueror, of the dominant racial culture. It's very hard to do liberation work using just English. You have to, you know, you have to deal with the negative. Person like myself becomes an anti-racist. It sounds negative. Thus, those criticizing the whole, you know, study of race and its historical dimensions can use that. I saw just this past week a woman in Connecticut at a school board in Connecticut saying that talking about race and the history of race and the history of oppression by race in this country was detrimental to the self-esteem of white kids and thus shouldn't be taught, you know, shouldn't be discussed because it was damaging our children's self-esteem. So language is not, you know, again, I learned from Reverend Buford. He said, unless you're in the arts, unless you are doing dance, unless you are, you know, have an understanding of the arts that doesn't require words, there's no way that you can speak with English without that being a sign of dominant culture. So it's language is so important. And it's so misunderstood in this culture. But I would just say that the whole notion of speciousness. I remember the first time I heard Dr. Washington, and speaking of Dr. Edwin Nichols and Dan Buford and others who would use the language that he's, you know, they'd say that race is a specious notion. Well, I thought they were talking about a species, you know, that it was legitimate, scientific. And they said, no, it's not species. That's a whole nother word. It's specious, meaning it appears to be true, but upon closer examination, it is false, you know, so that the language, I'll say this in closing. Today, white supremacy is about division of people of color, particularly Black people. It is about division. It will take even progressive realities if they speak to the division of Black people they will use it. So you will find many progressive whites, emphasizing, the particular and specific oppression of Black women, and implicit in their critique will be a legitimizing of the degradation of Black men, justifying the imprisonment and the murder by police. Not that there are not issues among Black women, Black men, but these issues can be warped by the dominant culture and used to white supremacist ends. So the use of language, and because I'm a preacher, I will end again. And I'll say, I heard Professors John McKnight and Jody Cressman at Northwestern years ago, 25 years ago, and I was in their audience. And they used a term and they called it minority youth at risk. And I said, oh, wow, what a phrase. I can use that phrase in my grants. I can write that phrase in my proposals, and I can get money to do my work, and so you would use terms like that, minority youth at risk, without ever engaging the people that you're actually talking about and their parents and saying, what do you think of a word like that? And if you ever did, if it was common to my experience, they said, don't use that phrase. It's demeaning, it's racist, it's white supremacist language, and you're using it to benefit your own program at the expense. So linguistics can't be overemphasized in terms of its importance. And it was just a wonder to hear Queen Esther, and I hope she can come back. And Daniel, it's always, I have learned so much from you and Dr. Mike that I would, just like to listen and on these radio shows, because listening to you makes me unsure of my own words, but that's great. And I appreciate being a part of this panel.
Thank you, and you always bring it whenever you deliver, my brother. So thank you, and God bless you for participating in this. I want to touch on something that you said before we move on to our first respondent, Captain Lyles. You talked about the situation with the parent in Connecticut who's concerned that learning the truth would be damaging to white people's self-esteem. Let's let that sink in for a moment. Let that marinate in your mind. That knowing the truth is going to be damaging to her self-esteem and her children. And when you said that, I'm thinking, well, how would she like to be called a slave, contraband, colored, a buck, a darky, uncivilized, a savage, underdeveloped? Would that make her feel good? We've had to be dealing with that crap as soon as they started teaching us what the language was. But now all of a sudden, when we're looking for parity, inequality, and equity in the language, that is damaging to their self-esteem. That right there is a white supremacist viewpoint, that equality is in language and reference to yourself as a human being puts them at a disadvantage to be a human being like everyone else, because the whole thing is set up for them to be on the top. So thanks so much for saying that. And then also about the word minority, which many people misinterpret that to refer to a numerical thing. Black people use that, for instance, but everybody is always known there's more black folk on the planet Earth than there is white people. But we don't control the dictionaries and so on. So that word doesn't apply to us in our numbers. It applies to us only with respect to our population in the United States and only with respect to our significance in this political and social order. Captain Lyles, what are your responses to these deep topics that we've heard thus far?
Well, I want to thank all of the participants because it was quite moving. I'll start off with Dr. Mike. Dr. Washington and his historical account of the history of the United States government.
Get closer to the mic, Reggie.
Okay, history of the United States government, making sure that who was a citizen and who was not a citizen. And that is, we have to always start there. But why did they do this? Who are the people who wanted this to happen and needed this to happen? You know, there's a phrase that says, abuse people, abuse people. And these folks who came here to the United States and who we've been taught to be so noble and righteous and et cetera, for this new land, there's supposed to be a light on a hill, et cetera. But they were discarded. They were considered the idle poor. They were considered by European standards as riffraff, rubbish, squatters, rednecks, hillbillies, clay eaters, bog trotters, sand ruffians, and trailer trash. Nancy Eisenberg, out of my home state of Louisiana, she's at LSU. She has a great book. It's a hefty read. It's called White Trash. I recommend that for everyone to look into this. And then you'll see why these folks act the way they act, because they were treated like that. They were considered rubbish and throwaway. So when they get to the United States, and of course engaging in the Atlantic slave trade and the ethnic cleansing of the West, they felt like they can do the same thing to the African American or the Negro and of course the indigenous people in this country. But it didn't just stop there. Then we have March 6, 1857, when Chief Justice Roger Taney doubled down in the Dred Scott decision, which was probably the most objectively racist language ever uttered in the American federal judicial system. You know, he said that the African American or the Negro had for more than a century before been regarded as being of an inferior order, and although unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which a white man was bound to respect, and that Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit. For his benefit. He was bought and sold and treated as an ordinary article of merchandise and traffic whenever a profit could be made by it. That's the United States Supreme Court speaking. So they had no intent for all, when they say that mythological statement, all men are created equal, they weren't invested in that. They were just talking about landowners and wealthy white folks, not the rubbish, not the trailer trash, not the homeless, etc. And we all know it doubled down even more. We know that the science of eugenics, which was studied and prosecuted here at the University of California at Berkeley and at Stanford University, well-regarded institutions. We know that Adolf Hitler, before his rise in the Second World War, sent his people to Stanford to study how the United States was treating the people he thought were discardable. We know what happened after that. We know that because of the way he thought, we have so many people sent to gas chambers and discarded. So America has a lot to be ashamed of around the language that they use. I want to bring up another point that Dr. Washington said. He stated that we need to use our own language in defense, and that is so true. We have to constantly be on guard about new terms and terminologies that are brought out so that we can counteract them and confront them in the public square. That's utterly important. But we shouldn't operate from a sense of, inferiority. We have to say, like Esther Yazi Lewis stated, I don't consider them superior. Consider myself superior. So that's equity. And that's how you have to respond to this.
Amen.
So I'll end with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Brother Reggie. Very quickly, you just used a great term, eugenics. It's great in the mind of the eugenicist, but not for anybody else. But that word, for those of you who have dictionaries or your thesaurus handy, write down that word, eugenics, and then draw a line under the EU, and then go to your dictionary and find all the words that begin with EU, and you'll find that they all connote or denote something that's good or well, like eulogy, euphemism, euphoria, or even Europe. Europa was a Phoenician princess who was raped by Zeus, who disguised himself as a white bull with wings, which goes to show you that any language that would come out of that kind of thought process is surely full of bullshit. So moving right along, I had to throw that in because that Europa thing is real deep. They all call themselves that, but do you really know what you're calling yourself when you say that you're a European? It's supposed to be something good. Reverend Joanne McClendon, who has taken time from her sermon preparation to be with us today. Reverend McClendon, what are your impressions about what you've heard? Joanne?
First of all, I would just like to say it's been a privilege to be a part of the listening audience for this presentation today, and all of them I have enjoyed immensely, and in many cases it has been a tremendous education to a lot of the history that Dr. Washington spoke about. And it brought to mind something that has always troubled me, living in this country that has always been referred to as a great country, that was never really for African American people. And so to grow up in this country as I did, starting my early education in elementary school in a segregated system that was easy to believe that this is the way all schools are. African American teachers, great teachers, but at the end of my elementary education, to be suddenly a part of an integrated school system because segregation of schools ended. And so I was starting to learn about other people. But nowhere in from the first grade to the 12th grade, all the way through college, I never had the opportunity to learn about my history as an African American girl. I never had the opportunity to learn my history. And so when I see and hear reading about critical race theory and all of the background orchestrations to create lesson plans that really do not focus on truth, that lesson plans that are intended to, as Dr. Washington said, obliterate oppression, and continue to perpetuate this ongoing intent to not really allow the truth of African American history to be taught in our schools in a way that our young people really do understand it and leverage it and have a sense of who they really are, and have an opportunity to understand that they can be whatever they really want to be under the right circumstances, within the right environments, with the right support systems, and with the drive to do so. So this whole opportunity today to hear from a lot of people about their experiences and their work in the United States as a result of forced oppression. I was very stricken by Esther Yazie's presentation, and I saw so many parallels to slavery and her experience with being forced to pull away from her Navajo origin, her being forced to learn the American way of life, and to be devalued as who she really was, to have her language, which she described as spiritual and powerful, devalued. So many things. I mean, there are just so many parallels there. So while it was informative and extremely educating to me to hear these things from so many different perspectives, it was also a very painful reminder of what I experienced growing up in this country as an African American girl, and what is still being perpetuated in the lives of young Black children to this day, who are having big struggles with reading and language and understanding, big challenges in our education system with not being valued, not being properly taught, and they're being socially promoted rather than tutored to learn and grow and be better, and to ultimately be good, strong citizens in this country. It's just all very disturbing to me. So it was kind of like a bittersweet opportunity, and I could say a lot more. I took a great deal of notes regarding a lot of the comments that were made today. I'm honored to have been a part of it, and I am continuing to struggle with how we get to a better place in this country with the ruling class still in place.
Thank you, Reverend McClinton, for your message right there. And I want to just kind of like tie into a couple of things that your comments made me think of. And you were talking about how you were socialized in a segregated educational system and a segregated social milieu. And part of that socialization was being taught things like the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag.
Oh, yes.
And all the other stuff that it's supposed to stand for. You were probably taught the Pledge of Allegiance and America the Beautiful and the Star Spangled Banner. That's just as a part of going to school. I mean, many schools still start the day with the Pledge of Allegiance, which reminds me as I think of the Star Spangled Banner and the controversy around Colin Kaepernick refusing to stand during the Star Spangled Banner in protest and in honor of the lives of the people who have been killed by police over the years and hunted down like they're animals over the years. They got all over him for refusing to stand during the singing of that anthem. Well,
Yes.
when has that anthem ever stood for black folk? Never. When is the
It
flag?
hasn't.
When is the flag ever stood for black folk? Never. When George Floyd was kneeling, was being knelt upon by Derek Chauvin, he was wearing a flag patch on his uniform. Now, how can we stand for the flag while he can be wearing that flag while he kills somebody with his hand in his pocket, looking around, making sure that everybody gets a picture of him doing that? So then,
Absolutely.
when we sing the Marine anthem from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, where exactly are those halls of Montezuma? They're down there in Mexico, where Cortez and anybody else that came after him that had white skin felt that they could butcher Native Americans, the Aztecs, the Olmecs, the Toltecs, with impunity. And so these kind of things we begin to think about now in terms we have language in us, and this language is supposed to guide us into better citizenship. But I'm just questioning the symbolism of all of that as, once again, I think about what David said in terms of this lady being upset about having an inferiority complex. The very teaching and incorporation and understanding of the English language by people, any people other than white, is designed to give us an inferiority complex. That's the very design of it. And so then that's where we are, and that's why we always have to be innovative with respect to our use of language, and that really is the threat of Ebonics. Reggie was in the Bay Area at the same time as I was, and you were there too, and you remember that whole brouhaha about Ebonics. Well, I made a pretty good piece of change writing a statewide adult education curriculum that showed how you could use Ebonics as a pedagogical tool, because Ebonics isn't just about the way that we are butchering the language by saying ain't and cussing and all of that stuff, but it has to do with how our worldview and our values are expressed in language. So when we talk about linguistic racism, we're talking about how language speaks of us. When we speak of Ebonics, we're talking about how we used the language to heal us. And so then we're just thankful for the comments that you've made and that the other people on the call have made. And is Amari on the line yet?
She had to go back to class.
Okay, well.
Well, Dan, you mentioned Ebonics, and I'm glad you did, because it was a great argument, and it divided the African Americans, those of us who have some form of education, who we think we are so enlightened, and those who are from the street. And we don't want to be like them and use Ebonics. We want to be like the dominant class and use proper, or quote unquote, the Queen's English. But it didn't stop Ebonics. Ebonics formed into hip hop, and we got a whole new language, a whole new way of communicating. African Americans and around the world use terms and terminology that I venture the average 45-year-old would not even understand. And they're communicating with one another, and they are making economy. They're turning themselves into millionaires and billionaires because of it. And they use this language totally different. And they're unashamed about doing it. And that is a form of Ebonics, and also speaks to what Queen Esther Lewis was saying when she's saying language is power. That's where your strength is. And that's exactly what's happening now. Yeah. I mean, I have this fascination now at my age to try to understand hip hop language. They got hip hop dictionaries and stuff, and I want to find out everything they're saying. I'm not trying to be silly. I'm going to find out how these young people are communicating their ideas. And they are communicating economy. They're talking about owning their own tapes and their own power over their own artistic products, and how to move, how to invest, and how to become moguls. They're not using the Queen's English. They're using the English or the language that they've developed. That's the power in linguistics.
Yeah. So thank you, Brother Reggie, for pointing that out. And as we come in for a landing here, I just want to say that prior to this taping, I had the opportunity to speak a little bit to a class that is being taught here at Northern Kentucky University by Dr. Washington. And today they were dealing with handing in papers and had been discussing some of the lectures that Dr. Washington has been doing on hieroglyphs. And then he wanted me to tie what I was going to say about linguistic racism into hieroglyphs. And so I just happened to have something in my notes about that subject, of course. So let me just say that, picking it back up on what Esther was saying about the Navajo language is a sacred language. That means that the language itself is based on the people's relationship to the Creator, and everything that flows from that is described in the context of the relationship to the Creator. Everything from the rocks, the water, the air, everything, anything that walks. The word hieroglyph means sacred language. And there's nothing sacred about the English language or the Spanish language. Those language systems are Indo-European languages that aren't based on the relationship to God, but more the relationship to power and oppression and class stratification. So then we have this within us, these sacred languages within us, as David pointed out, that because we've been forced to speak English, there's now a cognitive dissonance. We have forms of creativity and expressions that can't be expressed in words because of the hurtful nature of the words that they would have to be expressed in. The only way you can express those things is if you're a musician or a dancer or an artist, or you know how to do that. So I'll just say in closing, we all have to use words. We think using words. We define ourselves using words. Our innermost feelings are expressed in words. But when those words always have you coming up short and measuring with a different yardstick, then it is of necessity that you develop your own worldview and your own words based on your own historical and spiritual experiences. So we want to thank you for this time. This is the third in this series. Our last one will be dealing with militarism as applied racism, the martial enforcement of genocidal policies. And in that, we're going to do a deep dive into the police killing of black people.
Yes, thank you. I think that we will be doing that on November 15th, if I'm not mistaken. November 15th at 1 o'clock. It's a Monday. So that'll be our next installment, and our final installment of this series of discussions, basically on human rights. So until next time, this is Afrocentricity. Thank you. So long.